Thank you so much. The panelists will now have given a couple of minutes to comment on each other's presentations before we open up for questions. While the panelists are commenting, please just wave your hand at me or give me a signal if you want to say something, and I'll add you to the speakers list. But I will start with you, Ms. Badawi. I want to talk about perceptions, and you as a journalist. I spent the Easter holiday reading this book, A Good African Story, about the first African coffee brand that actually controlled the value chain and manufactured their own products in Africa. The author, Andrew Ruggiero, is underlining that despite a decade of growth and economic development, there is a constant need all the time to challenge the image that you mentioned of Africa, the negative image, Africa being a basket case, etc. And part of the problem stems from lack of sufficient airtime given to positive examples. And a natural consequence of this is the importance of branding and marketing. And he says that this is something that politicians, technocrats, and even development actors do not really understand, or they are strangers to it. It's more the realm of the private sector, perhaps, and journalists. But Africa's competitiveness rests heavily on this, on the image. And we have countries like China, South Korea, Malaysia, etc., that have really invested in building brands and brand development. How do you assess this process of building and development African brands, good African brands? Is this coming along?
Well, I mean, I think that you know, the book you mentioned is it's an important illustration of what Africa has to accomplish in order to completely justify a positive perception. So, I mean, you know, when you talk about, you know, the coffee chain and so on, we know, and it refers to what you were both discussing, my fellow speakers, about the need for Africa to be seen as more than just a producer of raw commodities. You know, one easy example is Nigeria produces more tomatoes in West Africa than, you know, just about anybody else, and yet it's the biggest importer of tomato puree and paste, mainly from Italy. So, you know, you can see that's a no-brainer, that you have to not only, you know, improve farming and put more money into it, but you've also got to develop, you know, that added value added to it. So I think that, that there is a growing acknowledgement, and there are clear examples of how Africa is trying to challenge the perception that it is essentially you know, a continent where you can't produce the kind of finished goods that the world wants. You know, you produce the cocoa but not the lovely chocolate. That's Nestle, and Lindt do that, and they take the raw product. So I think that when it comes to perception, what one has to make sure is that the fluidity and the changing situation is reflected, and you don't just do the, you know, make the assertions of, you know, Nigeria produces all these tomatoes, but it brings all the puree. You also point to the fact that there's a very serious effort in Nigeria to deal with this. You know, the brother of Dangote, the richest man in Africa, is trying to bring a canning tomato factory to Nigeria. So all I'm saying is that you have to show the picture as a whole and not just focus on the negative and then use that to discredit a whole continent, because you don't do that about anywhere else. So just very quickly, for example, if somebody's viewing the United Kingdom, a program about the National Health Service and its deficiencies and problems, they'll be watching it, but they'll also think, well, that's true, but you know what? They treated my great-grandmother really nicely when she was ill. They have other, you know, sources of information to give a more complete picture. But often when people are viewing, particularly in the West, Africa, they're viewing in a vacuum. They don't have the other kind of knowledge to fill in the gaps. So the you know, the headlines become the whole. So I think that that's the problem with news, because it does favour negative coverage of everything, but when it comes to Africa, it's difficult because that's all people see, and they think that's all that exists.
Mr. Tronvoll, I'd like to ask you as well. You mentioned the election in Nigeria might be a turning point for African democracies, etc. And there's a range of elections coming up this year. so you have a development that's positive in terms of political and civil rights, but at the same time you have countries in the east, Ethiopia and Rwanda, where they have very impressive economic development and not as good democratic development. How do you view this? Is economic development more important for some countries than democracy? How do you assess that development?
I think the two countries you're pointing at, Ethiopia and Rwanda, are probably the two countries on the continent which have the most and best articulated developmental ideology and own visions on where they want to take their countries 10, 15, 20 years ahead. They are very much ideological driven governments, and they have entrenched themselves in power to deliver that overall promise to become middle-income countries in 2025. And they are on a good way to achieve that. If that and the way they articulate the private sector, the business sector, the investment side of things is more like the Scandinavian countries were in the 1970s and 60s, where the private sector is just a small part of the developing the country, but where the state has to assume much more authority and power in designing the overall development of infrastructure and employment opportunities as such. If that is dependent on not having a genuine plural democracy, if that's your question, I don't necessarily think so. You might want to have both a genuine plural democracy and still achieve similar goals, but these governments have chosen to sequencing, if I can use that term, human rights. You have some primarily human rights they want to fulfill first, and the core individual civil political rights comes down the road when everything, all other pieces are put in place, so to say. And they are not hiding it. They're quite open about how they vision their own government's positioning and how they want to achieve their growth and development. I have huge respect for what they have accomplished. I have also a broad set of critical issues to raise with them on some of the more core human rights challenges they do have.
Thank you. And just remind you that you might just wave your hand at me and then I'll note you down. So we'll open for questions any minute soon. Jon Vea, how do you view this and the role of Norway in this? Børge Brende just signed a strategic partnership agreement with the African Union in Addis Ababa in January. You've been involved in this economic diplomacy drive in African countries. Do you see a new collaboration between Norway and African countries from forming this year?
Absolutely. We talk about perception of Africa. I think in Norway we had very strong perception of Africa 12, 15 years ago. It was hunger, it was conflict, and so forth. This has changed now. We have slowly recognized that Africa is, as I said, a very resourceful country, becoming more important in a global scene. We have also, and that's new for us, we have really discovered that we have developed economic ties that are so important. Who of you know that Norway is exporting the double amount value-wise to Angola than compared to India, 8 billion. The problem is that today there is no balance. There is hardly any exports from Angola to Norway. This has to do with the oil, the gas, oil supply industries and all these things. But it's a huge amount. So we have interest. We also see with the humanitarian importance we attach to attach to humanitarian things, to peace and stability. We see that there is a role also for Norway to try to work in Africa in order to contribute to these efforts. We see that the African Union has become a player, an important player. Now they are not only talking about economic cooperation in Africa, they are also discussing how the African Union can play a role in stabilizing the continent, play a role in peace efforts, etc. So this is understood. But of course, at the same time, I think it's very important to have a focus on how we can, in Norway, contribute in solving some of the bottlenecks. And then my strong opinion is that management of natural resources is an area where Norway should really try to assist African countries, because this is so important. Will continue to be important to many of these countries. And we have some, and I think we understand that we have some comparative advantages in some of these areas that is linked to management of natural resources, and there is a demand for this among most of the African countries. So I'm quite certain that we will see a continuation of the cooperation, an extension of the cooperation, and we will also see, and some of you are representatives of private sector in Norway, there is a much higher interest in Africa, in partnership in African countries, also in assisting in developing the private sector in Africa. And that's also something that we are putting in the new strategies in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. More weight on assisting the development of private sector in African countries. That will become more important. Public aid will be kind of a catalyst. We'll try to develop models where private sector will function, public financing, public aid will function more as a catalyst for bringing in more private sector. Norfund is an example of that thinking, actually.
Thank you. Yeah, of course.
Private sector.
Yeah.
I think what you say about the private sector is very important, but I think one thing we must remember with the private sector is that if you look at agriculture, for instance, in Africa, it's the biggest employer by and large in all countries, but they are usually smallholder farmers. So the SMEs, the small and medium enterprises, are critical for Africa's development and its employment. And yet when you look at private sector investment, both domestic and foreign direct investment, very little goes into the SMEs, and I think that is a huge failure on the part of foreign investment. I mean, you take one country like Nigeria, which has got, more banks than just about every other African country. Between 2 to 4% of bank lending goes to the agriculture sector, i.e., SMEs, and I think that is something that's very important. And you find that, foreign private sector investment wants to go into the big projects, the agribusiness, the big energy infrastructural projects and so on, which are seen as more lucrative. And I think that would be a huge oversight and failure.
Yeah.
Very brief comment on that. I very much agree. But it struck me when I was in Angola. Why is the government in Angola putting so much emphasis on the agriculture? Why are they not trying to develop the huge potential? When the Portuguese were there, the agriculture was growing like that, Then it collapsed. Now Angola is importing more or less a very big portion of its food coming from South Africa, Brazil, other countries. Why are they not putting more emphasis on that? But you are so right. Private sector in Norway finds it very difficult to go into SMEs because that's really risky business. And it's very difficult to develop small, medium-sized companies in Africa today because Africa is kind of trapped. They are under pressure to open their economies. How to protect the small, medium-sized companies. Most countries that developed have had kind of protection for their infant industries. We are pushing for opening, And then again, you have the Chinese challenge. Because China is so able to deliver everything. They establish themselves. They produce brick cheaper in Angola than the local, or they can sell brick more cheaply in Angola than an Angolan producer can do. So these are challenges. So I think the way for Africa, and then I comment on that, please. Africa has to find a new way. There are so many talents among the young people, and you see in certain sectors that Africa is coming and are getting much recognition. Modes, or what do you call clothes, dressing, music. Africa is conquering the world there, I think.
Yeah, and there's short comment. We got a short comment from Mr. Tronvoll as well. Before we open up, we have questions here as well.
I think what we're seeing exactly is that since the primary drivers of the economic growth in Africa is now private consumption, and it's only over the last 10 years or so we can start to measure the growth of the middle class in African countries. And you have to give it some time. And because the middle class will demand local goods and consumptions in a different manner than earlier. And then the rebranding, as your book also hints at, will be pushed by that growing middle class. But you don't start a business from one day to the next. It's only the last 10 years we have seen the middle class actually being a force of consumption and investments. So you see a lot of transformation. That's really the area of transformation in this sector. So I'm very optimistic on that part of it.
Thank you. We have a question from you, sir. Yeah, please.
What is the risk of resurgence of tribalism in Africa, which might actually wreak havoc in the continent? And we know that, I mean, artificially drawn borders in the Middle East are very fragile, right? 5 years ago, we thought Syria, Iran, Iraq, they were rock solid. But we know that people up north Nigeria has more ethnically with Niger. We know that people of Tutsi tribe actually live in many different countries. Suddenly, I mean, they have also their own military forces, different militia. That this tribalism actually destroy the whole process of democratization in the continent.
Okay, there was a question here about the resurgence of tribalism, still a huge problem. Do you want to start with?
Can I just say, I think that I don't buy that argument at all. And I don't for two reasons. If you take, for example, a country like Nigeria, which has that huge ethnic diversity you mentioned, it is also a federation. You have 36 states in Nigeria, which have a great deal of power. And by and large, that has kept the country together for a country that was only formed in 1914, where you've got this huge variety. Secondly, as I said, I was born in the Sudan. And the argument you gave was what gave rise to South Sudan becoming created, you know, as the world's newest nation. The idea being that in the north, from where I'm from, where we speak Arabic as our native language, where we are Muslim and Arabized Africans, the southerners being ethnically completely different, you know, large majority of Christian animists and some Muslims, much more African in their culture and their appearance, that they couldn't coexist with the northerners, and they broke away. Has it brought them peace? No, it hasn't. It hasn't. Arguably, it's actually brought more deaths, because even though they are ethnically very similar, the Dinka and the Nuer and the Shilluk and so on, they all look the same, you can't tell the difference. They have very similar tribal customs and so on. It has not brought them. So this idea that, you know, you can have, you know, now they're talking about perhaps there'll be a Nuer land, that people of different tribes, of different ethnicities, of different religions cannot live together. I don't buy that argument, because if you do, by extension, you are saying that people of African or Arab or Asian descent who are living in Europe cannot coexist in a multicultural Europe, that you have to have homogeneity wherever it is in order for a country to exist peacefully. And that's not a good message to propound once you carry on with it.
Okay, there's a comment from Tronvoll as well.
Yes, I think we also mentioned the artificialness of the borders and territories in Africa. The two newest states in Africa, and the only two states formed after post-independence period, is South Sudan as the newest and Eritrea as the second newest in 91-93. And senior diplomats, both Norwegians and international diplomats, draw attention to these two cases as never again create a new state in Africa, because it only collapses and create new wars and new dynamics. So the solution to redraw borders has not proven to be the right solution, at least based only on two empirical cases. What we do see then is the trend of devolution of power, new federal systems, the new Kenyan constitutions, the devolution of power there, the new Ethiopian constitution, the draft Tanzanian constitution, which will be voted on later this year, all devolve power to sub-national entities to appease tribalism, as you call it, or ethnic groups' demands of inclusion or autonomy. I think the main challenge for African states is not the borders. The main challenge is the redistribution of wealth, where we see some elites have cemented power and harnessed all the wealth to their own families or their own ethnic groups. So that's the challenge, to redistribute the enormous resources political elites, economic elites in African countries do hold.
Thank you. And then we have Ms. Junvel. Would you?
I just agree, but I think that DRC is kind of an interesting example. The reason why the conflict continues and continues is because of the collapse of the central authority or central state, actually, because they have no power to kind of influence in the eastern region. There is a vacuum there, and then people or leaders, tribal leaders, exploit that situation and use ethnicity and religion for their own purposes. But I think most Congolese people do not really want to split the country. They want to have Congo as one state, actually, also in the east, really. Of course, few want to split the country, but I think that is not considered a solution to the problems. In my view, it's so important that you have a state that functions and can deliver services and then get loyalty from the population, actually.
Thank you. Short comment, and then we have. Okay.
Because actually, what we're seeing is a reverse trend: the establishment of regional cooperation bodies, the East African Community, on a fast track to a union 5-10 years from now, in order to go beyond the problem of ethnicity to statehood, that you lift it up a level instead of breaking it down a level. And that's also happening in the West and the South. And I think that is much more promising also for the industry, because you have harmonization of regulative and law measures at a higher level than the country level. And East Africa is driving that process on the continent.
Thank you. Then we have a question from you, sir, from behind here.
My question was exactly about that, the regional cooperation. You see that as a trend in Africa. It's a trend in many continents, regional cooperation. And this East African community is setting an example for the rest of the continent.
Okay, there's a question about regional cooperation if Africa is setting an example for other places. Would you say or
I have
please?
stated my opinion on that.
Yeah, you have.
Yes, yeah.
Say no, please.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think that East Africa, as you say, is really, well ahead of the pack there. President Kagame of Rwanda, for instance, has introduced visa-free travel for actually all Africans, trying to, break down the borders. And I think, as we said, because Africa is such a big country, that you do see, regional cooperation in terms of building infrastructure and more intra-African trade, which is very important, because Africa, as we know, as a region in the world, trades within itself much less than just about any other region in the world. So it's easier to achieve these kind of objectives of, better infrastructure, industrializing, more intra-African trade, more political cooperation, when you do it on a kind of regional basis, be it SADC in the south, ECOWAS in the west, or IGAD in the east. And you also see them playing a useful political mediation role when it comes to, for instance, trying to sort out the problems of South Sudan, or, the issues of Somalia and so on. So I think that regional is very, very good, and I think that if we see, progress made on a regional basis, collectively, the continent will really be lifted.
Okay, I have 7 more questions right now, so we'll just jump straight to it. I think we'll take 2 questions in a row now. You, sir, first. Please present yourself when you ask questions, so we know who you are.
Thank you very much. My name is Kjetil from the Development Fund of Norway. We work with small organizations supporting small-scale farmers in Africa. I think since we are here in Oslo, there are 2 important questions that need to be discussed here for me. One is, when we've heard that the institutional capacity in Africa is so low that they don't even challenge the private sector and extract industry. And I think the West has a responsibility to build capacity in this development cooperation. But increasingly, that kind of support still hints at in a wrong place or organizations that may not necessarily support those kind of small-scale farmers, for example, which are in poverty. What more can they play? One thing. Then the other thing is there are instruments at international level today, policies and instruments at international level. For example, just to name, in the name of innovation, we have today intellectual property right to incentivize innovation. And then this leads to resource grant. A very simple example, Ethiopia lost its staple crop because a company from the Netherlands patented hemp. And Ethiopia cannot negotiate with any EU member state today to commercialize its super grain. And this is a resource grant. What responsibility has the West to do human rights impact assessment for global food security when it comes to international instruments like the activity should be implemented? Is it just to benefit the private sector here to build the economy in the West, or to balance the development as a whole?
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Could you ask people to speak a bit louder?
Yes.
Especially from old lady from the
I will, and I will repeat. There was a question about building capacity in the wrong places, not benefiting small-scale farmers, etc., and also resource theft. That was. We'll come back to that. We'll just take your question as well, please.
Quite another line, but it's a little alarming that none of you has pointed to the question of education as a factor of growth in a society. I don't think that any society over years can have neither economic growth nor democratic growth unless you have educated people. So my question is not if children go to school for 7 years, but how is it at university levels? Do you see any new universities? Are there new things that they take up? Are there collaborations between European universities and African universities? So how is that going on?
Thank you. It's a question about education at university level. And then you, the young gentleman here. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Adam. I'm from Kenya. My question is similar to what he said. Africa, like, one of the challenge and opportunity for Africa is capacity, and more so in the demographic aspect. Africa is growing in terms of population, and 2/3 of the population in Africa is made of youth. And now to come to the education aspect, what contributions are made to the education system in Africa? Because, like, for me, as a young person, I don't see the relevance of my education because it's too rigid compared to what's evolving outside. So what mechanisms are put in place, especially for the donors, to help curb that challenge?
Yeah, thank you. It's a question about relevant education for young Africans. Please just remember to keep your questions short and loud, as I mentioned. Okay, we can start with perhaps Jon this time.
The question of education, of course, it's important. It's a focus area for our foreign ministry and for the Prime Minister of Norway, that Norway should really assist in bringing education to all, not least girls. But the problem, in my view, is that education as such, well, it's important, but you should try to educate people for jobs. And I think there's a big lack in Africa for a good institution for vocational training. The curriculum of these institutions should be updated so you train people for the jobs. They have to be employable, actually, and there's a lot to do there. In my view, that is an area that we have to have high focus on, actually.
You can
Yes.
comment on the question behind here.
Yes, let's follow up on education before I take Tsehome's question. I think we see 2 or 3 trends, which kind of is contradictory when it comes to educational capacities in Africa. You see a huge investment by certain countries, like Ethiopia, for instance, in public universities and higher institutions of learning. Ethiopia has gone from 1 university in 1995 to 38 universities today. Impressive growth, unparalleled on the continent. then of course you can put a question mark on the quality of education delivered at those institutions. But nevertheless, you do have an institutionalization process, which is remarkable in Ethiopia, and it's following suit in other African countries. But that's the public universities. In many countries, you see the proliferation of private colleges and universities with very much a variety of quality of education, and a lot of that is kind of business enterprises in their own right, without necessarily providing the necessary educational backstopping to the youngsters of Africa. A positive trend is, again, African academics in diaspora is re-engaging back to their home countries and bringing with them higher academic standards, if I can use those terms, because they have a better context where they have been working in Europe or America. And again, infusing that into the public sector universities in Africa, and then of course helped by Norway, hopefully, and other global donors, prioritizing now the educational sector. I agree 100% with the vocational training. But then just one second on Zeinab, then still in. I think your issue there on the property rights is crucial, intellectual property rights for African countries. Ethiopia has one of the strongest, actually, bureaucracies for intellectual property rights due to your coffee production and the original coffee in Ethiopia. But still, nevertheless, teff was stolen from you, the super grain, which is now kind of promoted worldwide for its qualities. And I think there you have both an lack of knowledge base and lack of institutional capacities in African countries. Not only African, developing countries as such. New Guinea, other Southeast Asian countries are enduring the same as Ethiopian African countries, which I think goes beyond an individual country's concern. It should be more international regulations and mechanisms put in place to defend intellectual property rights for the African industries.
Okay, thank you. We'll have very few minutes left. Please keep your questions short and loud, and present yourself. Please, you first.
My name is and I'm a researcher here at the University of Oslo. I wanted to go back to the issue of the level of inequality that Ambassador told us, because you talk about the level of inequality is a huge risk for businesses that go into the region, and normally it's not taken into account because businesses just go there and don't see that people actually live below the poverty line. How can businesses actually narrow this risk? Because putting the question around, how can businesses actually contribute to job growth within the region? Is this done on regional level? Is this done at a regional level, having a more international sort of platform? How can we actually do this? And what is, of course, the role of education in all this process?
Thank you. There's a question about businesses and inequality. How can they contribute to job growth? At what level? Then we have the lady over here by the window.
My name is Tronvoll. I'm a journalist at Norwegian. You have talked about the overall trends, and I want to ask you a question about that when it comes to one issue that you have hardly touched upon, which is corruption, and which many will assess being the largest threat to an improved security and economical development in Africa. To give you an example, I think it was BBC last night that reported that 2 Al-Shabaab leaders that had been arrested in Kenya, they were released because they had bribed the police officers. So, of course, it doesn't help fighting terrorism. Another example, I remember speaking to a young, talented, well-educated engineer in Congo a few years ago, asking him, why don't you set up your own workshop, create your own job? And he says, well, there is no point in paying the taxes to the tax office because the only result is that my money goes into the clergyman's or the clerk's pockets. So I'm unemployed. So far for the education, and the tax system, because corruption prevents the economical development. So what is the trend? Is fighting corruption going on in Africa as well?
Yes, thank you for that. Is fighting corruption going on in Africa? Is paying taxes futile? We'll have one last question in this round, and then we'll have one more round, and then we'll finish up. It's you, sir.
Thank you very much. We are actually talking about long-term cooperation, I assume. We are talking about cooperation between private industry in the Western world and public industry in Africa. Now, in this context, what is the evaluation of the panel when it comes to the so-called PPP organizations? PPP stands for Public-Private Partnership. Thank you.
Okay. That was a question about public-private partnerships. Let's take a round now where maybe Zeinab, you can start this round and just share the questions amongst
Just very quickly on corruption. I think if you look at Mo Ibrahim, who has the Ibrahim Index of Good Governance in Africa, he's the former telecoms billionaire who's dedicated his fortune now to trying to improve governance across Africa. The trend is getting better. So I'm not saying corruption is not a problem, but again, it's looking at his index, it is getting better. And I would just say on corruption that yes, of course, you can look at the bribery of a police officer and so on, but I think what interests me more is the kind of corruption that goes on in Africa that involves also Western companies by and large. So if you look at just one figure, for instance, Kofi Annan looking at this illicit financial flows from Africa involving Western corporations says that $50 billion leaves Africa. And that's with the complicity of lack of corporation tax, that kind of thing. And that is exactly the infrastructure deficit for investment on the continent. So I think, go after the big guys, but you are right to raise this issue of taxpayer morale and the trust. Tax is more than just taxation. It is also about, trust between government and its citizens, which is why it's important to bring it. And the OECD is doing a great deal of work on that with African governments through its, tax inspectors without borders, not quite Médecins Sans Frontières kind of popular ring, but at least it's going in the right direction. I think another very quick thing on corruption that's helping, and it touched with what you said earlier on, which about people worried about increasing erosion of press freedoms. I think one thing that one should remember in Africa is that there are 3 mobile phones for every 4 citizens in Africa, and that's equivalent to what you have in India. And I think when you look at the role of social media, particularly with younger people, it's a very, very powerful anti-corruption tool. It's much harder for governments to, hide what's going on because people can communicate with one another. So I think the role of social media as a trend and increasing internet penetration in Africa means that for any government anywhere, actually, it's going to be difficult to try to keep things quiet. If there's violence during an election, people will know about it. I think on the question of inequality is a problem for just about every country in the world, including, where I live, the United Kingdom. And I think it's important that the private sector does not entrench those inequalities. And I think that when it comes to the private sector, it's absolutely critical for development. The clothes we wear, the food we eat, the water we drink, the lights and everything is private sector. So I think it's very important that it's used as a tool for development and not promoting inequalities. I can't remember what the other one was now.
It was
really.
Public-private partnerships.
PPPs I think are important, of course, and we've seen some very clear examples on the continent of how that has worked. More in the kind of big projects, I'm thinking of the Badawi Dam in Uganda, which was a very successful PPP that now accounts for 50% of Uganda's electricity, and that was, a tripartite to private sector, Blackstone, the Aga Khan Development Network, as well as the Ugandan government, and that's seen by and large as a fairly good example of PPPs. So I'm sure that is going to be something we'll see more of.
Thank you. We'll only have time for 2 more questions, and then it's your final statements. We can just take them very briefly. You first, very briefly.
I'm from University of Oslo, a student. My question is, to which degree is it you agree on in order to let the economic and the investment be grow and increase in a good way, how much it is a hidden political and to develop and to help Africa? I meant, in other words, is it Africa a market for international product like pharmacy drugs? When I don't know if you get my question.
Okay, thank you. And then it's you, sir. Please.
Yes, my name is Abdullah Mire, journalist who recently arrived here in Norway. My question is, my understanding is that there's one crisis that need to be, in my view, need to be erased or stopped. That's the crisis of refugee. The person you see standing in front of you is born in a refugee camp, the world's largest refugee camp, Badawi. Until recently, I came to Norway 6 months ago. I didn't know anything other than the refugee camp. So are the other Somali refugees in Badawi, also Sudanese lost boys who have been refugees since 1980s. So my point or my question is, how can we stop these refugees? And the refugee problem now in Kenya, particularly where I came from, is that the tribatos agreed, that is the United Nations, Somali government and the Kenyan government have agreed to repatriate on voluntary basis. And any time that any insecurity happen in Kenya, when the Al-Shabaab destroyed grenades, or the Garissa attack, or the Westgate siege, as we all know, the first blame is the Somali refugees in Badawi. And mind you, most of the people who are radicalized, who have been in courts for these attacks, none of them comes from the refugee camp. Most of them are Kenyans who have been radicalized around, unfortunately.
Please, your question, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what is the way out for these African refugees, largely in South Sudan and Somalia?
Okay, thank you. And then there was a refugee question. We will now let you have your, you can answer these questions, and that will be your final statements as well, because we have, we're running out of time here. So please, maybe you can start.
A few words on corruption and lack of transparency. I think these two things have to be seen together. I see some positive signs. I have fully shared the view of Zeinab that the access to mobile phones, social medias are very important, because now they can much more organize kind of resistance towards the corruption level that you have among governments, entities, and so forth. That's a problem. So that can be addressed. But I think a big share of the responsibility for corruption also lies with the private companies that operate in these countries. I see some positive signs. Those countries that are on the international stock markets, they have to kind of report on so many aspects of corruption, lack of transparency, and so forth. And I can tell you that in the country I know so well, Angola, due to lack of transparency, it was not possible for two very significant Norwegian companies to continue the negotiation of billion-dollar contracts, because lack of transparency. There has to be transparency. And I think that we have also come to a level, and that refers to public-private partnership, that will develop. That process we see, of the tendency we see to more and more of PPPs, that will continue. But I think the precondition for that kind of partnership is that there is a shared view of what our responsibilities. I think we have come to a point where, for instance, Norwegian authorities have very clear expectations towards the companies when it comes to corporate social responsibility. I think job creation is slowly becoming also a part of that corporate social responsibility thing. And then you combine public or Norwegian government goals with what other, you can kind of create win-win situation, because this is also important for companies to contribute in job creation, because that is becoming, because the governments in most countries now are aware of the fact that they can negotiate, they can put up conditions for the companies. I mean, to get access, you have to deliver on job creations, and you see tendencies towards that. But we still have to develop the concept of partnership between governments and private sector when it comes to trying to achieve development goals in African countries. But there is a positive tendency.
Thank you. Thank you. We need to respect your time and schedule as well.
Sorry.
So 1 minute closing statement from Mr. Tronvoll.
I think you were very harsh against me here. I feel discriminated.
Sorry.
Then let me talk about your question on corruption. We see several trends. First of all, business leaders themselves say that corruption is higher and worse in Asia than in Africa. That's the business leaders' indexes on that. Yes, there is a serious problem in Africa, definitely, in many countries. But things are changing in one way and staying stable in the other. The grand-scale corruption, the entrenchment of political enrichment is continuing, sadly enough, and particularly in strong countries as Kenya, as Tanzania, East African countries. There are hugely grand-scale corruption scandals after scandals every month, which doesn't change unless some substantial political transformations will happen. Maybe the link now of corruption to security threats might impact that. Why hasn't Al-Shabaab managed to hit Ethiopia one time? Ethiopia is the main enemy of Al-Shabaab overall. And why are they repeatedly hitting Kenyan targets over and over and over again? It's because of the security forces of Ethiopia and the non-corruptedness of that. You can disqualify them or criticize them on many grounds, but at least they deliver security, and they're not corrupt for the Ethiopian people and for the Ethiopian industry, for that matter. Kenya doesn't, and the Kenyan businesses will be hurt, and the FDIs to Kenya will suffer because of the corrupted level of the security sector in Kenya. So they need to change it, I think. But this is a long-term process. It's not fixed overnight. I think also what we see of some of the Western or internationally based stock market enterprises in Africa, due to the US regulations and the EU regulations on corruption, they are very much afraid of entering into any kind of shady businesses. And also the trend among some of the sector, where Statoil is in a forerun, the publish what you pay philosophy, where they now do that in Angola as the first country. What are Statoil paying in royalties, in taxes and so on, to make it public to the Angolan society, so they can put pressure on their own government of making that money accountable. That is a trend I think the industry itself need to pick up much more seriously and take the responsibility to do that in order for the communities themselves to put pressure on their leaders.
Thank you, Mr. Tronvoll. And Zeinab.
Just very quickly on the refugee situation, I think you're right to say to invert the telescope, as it were, and to see the problem perhaps more as existing problems that the Somali community has in Kenya and being integrated and so on. I think that is, it's a clear situation that when you do have attacks, as you had at the Garissa University, that those existing prejudices will provide a framework whereby the authorities can look for a scapegoat. But really that's because there's been a failure to address the problem of the refugees. I think refugees, IDPs, internally displaced people are a problem in some parts of Africa, that they are people who are, denied their rights and so on. It's something that Antonio Guterres at UNHCR has, talked a great deal about. I think just very quickly on refugees, it's worth reminding people that most countries that host refugees tend to be the poorer countries in the world, not the richer nations which will complain about the odd 100 coming over or whatever. I think that all I would say, I must end on a positive note, is yes, there are all these issues, but let's not have any kind of exceptionalism when it comes to Africa. Africans are like just about everybody else on the planet. They have the same aspirations for their children. They want a good education. They want the skills that will, underpin the jobs that the economies need to industrialize, to advance and so on. They want health services. They want welfare provision and so on. So let's not, make an exception of Africa. I think that Africa and Africans actually, other than anybody else, have been subjected to a certain infantilization by the international community over centuries, probably decades and years. Let's not have this infantilization. Let's not be scared off by the activities of a minority like Boko Haram in Nigeria. And I just end with the words of when I was, we had a breakfast meeting not that long ago in London a couple of months ago where the guest speaker was Jim O'Neill, the former chief economist of Goldman Sachs, a British guy and so on. And there was a question put to him about Nigeria and, you know, how can people invest in Nigeria when you've got Boko Haram and so on. And he said, you know what, I'm very optimistic about Nigeria. There's no problem with it. And if you look at the figures, you know, FDI and investment and so on, a disproportionate amount of that goes into Nigeria. So I think let's not be scared off by the headlines. You know, people carried on investing in the UK even when the IRA activities were at their height. So let's not have exceptionalism and infantilization of Africa, except that there are growing numbers of Africans who are demanding and asserting themselves on the political, social and cultural agendas of their country. It's moving in the right direction. Go to the continent, you'll see the great vivacity and verve and spirit, and entrepreneurial spirit, because the private sector was invented in Africa, of the Africans, and let's just hope that the people of Africa get the future they deserve.
Thank you so much, and thank you.